Hey, you two, Petey Twofinger here with this great story. I'll just come out and give the story so then I can spend the rest of the time talking. So, repair of an iconic 60s era synthesizer turns into a long, strange trip for an engineer. The Buchla red panel LSD legend was true. So, what this is, there is a synthesizer in a basement, and they're going to take the synthesizer and move it into the museum because it's part of the 60s countercultural experience in the West Coast. So they take this synthesizer, they give it to this guy who is a pro tech and expert, and he goes about disassembling it and cleaning it and preparing it for the museum, getting it all ready to work and function. And basically, I need to kind of explain quickly what the Buchla was. It was named after Bob Buchla. Is it Bob Buchla? I am Don Buchla. Robert Moog. You know Moog, a Moog synthesizer? Moog was on the East Coast in New York. And at the same time, Don Buchla was developing his own Buchla synthesizer in San Francisco. Now, history gave us one clear winner, and we'll explain more on that later. But basically, at the same time, they were doing about the same thing. The only thing was Don Buchla was on the West Coast, where they were smoking weed and taking acid. And on the East Coast, that scene there was like alcoholism, cocaine, and heroin. So, pretty much, Moog, he decided to use a keyboard, and you would use this device to make traditional music and have it play a 12-tone scale. So he divided 1 volt per octave scale idea called control voltage, and that's still in use today on rudimentary systems. But the Buchla guy, he just built an oscillator, which is a circuit that just produces a tone, and put it on a knob. So you would turn it, get a high tone, or turn it the other way and get a real low tone. And then he would get a filter, and that would change the timbre or the treble and bass mixture. Then he would get build a pair of these and set them at different. And if you just started playing with the knobs, you could make this rudimentary soundscapes or droney type of. It's really noise. It's not so much music, but when you start adding a lot of accoutrement, a lot of more circuitry, and when you become adept at operating this, it certainly is something else. So he would cut wood and make like a box and have these panels that he would cut out of tin snips, a panel about this big, and have the knob, maybe the switch, and a little jack for a wire to come out, and then a couple of screws, and that would screw. So you would have the parts on the back of that, the controls on the front. You would screw this down, and then make another one, and another, and another, and then he had it at a 45-degree angle, a bank of all these controls, and then it would go straight up and have room for even more panels. So the myth about Don Buchla and him building his Buchla synth, which it's so cool. If you like this idea, you need to watch a movie called I Dream of Wires. There's a 90-minute version, and there's a 3-hour or 4-hour version, super long cut. And I got that right when it came out, and then I got the whole thing and watched it twice. It's great, especially the beginning, which is this kind of, it's almost like the space race, but we have Robert Moog and Don Buchla. And I love the Buchla. It's so weird, and there's no keys on it. You play it with just a bunch of knobs, but it's still really cool. And obviously, the music that you're going to come up with. There's a Buchla album. Anyway, the rumor was, and this kind of gets into that whole thing of the scene, like I said, with the West Coast, San Francisco, with Grateful Dead. There was weed, and like you worked out, you did surfing. Like alcohol was discouraged. You were supposed to eat well. Like there was vegetarian stuff. The first vegetarian restaurant was in San Francisco. So this Buchla would go to these freakouts where they would have light projection, like these jello lights, and it would look like the wall was melting, different colors. And at one point, they thought it would be a funny idea to paint one of these, the red panel on the synthesizer with LSD, with liquid acid. And then they had people, oh, you come on up and, there's a pretty girl. Because they're all doing their, like, the first hippie was some guy who had a dance troupe. And he was a jazz boy. He was like, and he had these, like, he was like 70, but he was all buff. And he had a wife, but then he had all these like young 16-year-old girls that were like his little teeny bopper dancers, and they would just show up like at the whiskey and dance. And that was like, I forget his name. He's some like Don Vilento or like Vito Gus Valenius or something. He's got some weird name, but like that whole thing was going on, and Don Buchla would basically just kind of show up, take some acid, and fire up his synth, and they were like, hey, let's, like the Grateful Dead were there, they were like, let's paint the red panel on this thing with acid, and then invite people up to try the synth, and when if they touch that red panel, Houston, we got a problem. So that whole scene was in that movie. One guy talked about painting that panel red, the red panel with LSD, and he was laughing about it, and it seemed like a really irresponsible thing to do. Back then, LSD was still legal, and I know that if you read a little bit more about what really went on, they were giving it to everybody, and like it was very irresponsible because they were overdose. They were giving people like incredible amounts. I mean, the guy who invented LSD is a man named Albert Hoffman. He it spilled on his hand, or he put it on his hand. It's not really clear. And then he started feeling he was tripping. And he told the people at his work, I gotta go. And he rode his bicycle home. And he said he had this, it was this incredible bike ride. He was coming up on it. And then he went inside and sat down on his chair. And he said it got so intense that he saw himself. His spirit left his body. He astral projected. His spirit left his body. And he went floating around his and saw himself. And I guess he could see his neighbor. There was a woman through the window, and she was not a friendly woman, and that freaked him out. He said that when he was tripping, she was a witch. And that's Albert Hoffman, Bicycle Day. It's like April 4th or something. But that poor guy, my bastard child, LSD. He took it until he was 94 when he died, or was he 102? He was really old, and he took it almost every day his whole life. He, like, when he got old, he would take acid and go in his garden and just like trip out on the leaves and the soil and the insects. And he would say anyone who looks at nature and denies the hand of God is a fool. You tell me that's a bad drug. You tell me, oh, it is a little bit like reaching for the apple, you know. So we must be very careful, but I really never believed that story. And it broke on October 15th of 2019. Here, listen to this.
A groundbreaking musical instrument from decades ago.
So the rumor is part of it was dipped in LSD.
Julia Goodrich spoke to a KPIX5 staff member who had a trippy way of discovering if the rumor is true.
So the Buchla is in this basement, in this cold, damp basement. And somebody's like, we got to put this on display in our museum. So they give it to this technician, pro-tech and expert guy, and they're like, hey, we're going to have you tune that thing up and then get it all nice and clean, and we're going to put it in the museum. So he gets in there with a screwdriver and gets on that red panel that they had painted with the LSD, and he said there was a chunk of some crystalline-looking matter underneath one of the pots. So he pulled that pot out of there and sprayed some shit on there. I have the stuff that he used to spray. It's a DST, or I forget what it's called. Anyway, he sprayed this contact cleaner on there, and then he flicked this little booger off of the red panel. And he should have known. I mean, you're working on the Buchla, and it's got the red panel on it. Don't flick that booger. That's Owlsley. That's Stanley Owlsley made LSD. That's the purest out. 40 years old. Anyway, the guy tripped his balls off for 9 hours from touching this Buchla, this synthesizer. And that's the story. You can look into it more. I'll leave a link. It says the Trips Festival, Sunday at 8 p.m., Longhorn Men's Hall, Fisherman's Wharf. Ken Kesey and the Acid Test, the Merry Pranksters, and more. The Grateful Dead, the Holding Company, and many noted outlaws. I mean, can you imagine it? Like, this was what was going on back then. There was these shows where you would be able to see, like the Dead and Jimi Hendrix, and then the Who. Like, you know, yeah, this is a pretty good show. I like that second band. You know, it's just absolutely ridiculous. So this Buchla, the red panel legend was true. Synth pioneer Don Buchla's instruments grew out of the West Coast counterculture movement of the 60s, when electronic music was light shows and psychedelic drugs were intertwined. So Buchla was associated with events like Stuart Brand's San Francisco Trips Festival, which was described as the trip or electronic performance as a new medium of communication and entertainment. And Buchla says, I just showed up at these places with my instruments, took some acid, played some music. So yeah, this guy Curtis cleaned up the Buchla, and he touched the red panel, which was a huge mistake. I just think it's so interesting if you consider how these chemicals have sculpted our reality. That, like, on the West Coast, we had the hippie trip. We had working out, suntan, surfing, trying to get that hot girl, vegetarianism, smoking weed, using psychedelics as a bridge, as a sacrament to gain, like the Indians. When the Indian kid comes to a certain point, he's going to become a man, using that LSD as that type of sacrament. Not where it's, hey, I got some of this, let's go every Friday night and trip out, man. They're only doing it once or a couple of times, because because they don't need to do it any more than that if they're doing it right. And out of that comes this culture where we have these two guys at the same time. One of them's in New York, where we have a lot of homosexuality, we have a lot of alcohol. It's a ghetto. There was heroin and cocaine, and that was the scene, and that turned into slam dancing and punk rock. And the guy on the East Coast, he saw the dollar signs in his head. He made these oscillators and filters and combined them, these circuits. And right away he realized, I need to put this, 12-tone scale traditional keyboard on this so musicians could use it. Where Buchla, coming out of that weed culture, that expanded mind, that LSD like alternate thing, was like, we don't need no stinking keyboard. Why would we? We can just turn the knobs, man. The keyboard is going to restrict our notes. That's going to make it square, and it's going to be stepped. Where these knobs are linear, and they glide through the frequencies. So, of course, you end up, to me, it makes perfect sense that 40 years later, there's this technician in the emergency room, and they got to give him a couple of, half a dozen Valiums to calm the guy down. But the fact that San Francisco counterculture gave us the Buchla, it does not surprise me at all. And that Moog, coming out of the East Coast, gave us, who were remembered like nobody knows. And there's an album, there's a Buchla album. I would love to hear that. Like, yeah, but that's a toe tapper. You wouldn't want to take any mind-altering substances and listen to it. Listening to it would be more than enough on its own. But it was just an incredibly interesting story. I heard about it in that, I believe it was in that movie, I Dream of Wire. So make sure, if you can only find the 90-minute part of it, the one that's just on YouTube, you're not doing your job. You need to get a torrent or whatever you can do to see the full version. You might want to go looking around on F movies, 123 movies, wherever you can find the usual places. But just how it is, like I said, with that like punk coming out of that heroin thing, that addiction, and like the alcohol is acceptable, and then how we have this completely different aesthetic, where like it wasn't cool to drink, it was okay to smoke. That's what you did, and how that stuff shaped who we became. That is our culture. That's who we are. It's just absolutely amazing. I love the story of the red panel on the Buchla, and the fact that this technician actually tripped 40 years later is absolutely amazing. This story made me so happy today. There's another LSD story that I tell in one of my other videos about a police undercover guy who worked with these bikers. The bikers had a LSD lab. They had a guy who could cook LSD, and I don't know why they were cooking acid. They should have been cooking speed. They probably was probably doing both, to tell you the truth. But the whole thing with the bikers and the speed, the problem with that, excuse me, I'm so sorry for that interruption. The whole problem with that was the bikers were flipping out and they were attacking each other. It was hypersexualizing them, and and it was unbelievably addictive, and people were overdosing. So it turned out to be a bad drug. So these bikers were cooking LSD, which is not an easy chemical process to do. Anybody can make LSD, but to make it clean requires love. Now, this guy works himself. He's an undercover cop. He's got the beard. He looks his tattoos. He works himself in. And eventually, they do the bust and they get the guys. And he's been working a year and a half on this case. And he's like, I'm so happy this is the day. He shaves his face because he hates this beard. And he goes in this lab where they've been working. And he's documenting stuff. He's taking stuff for evidence. All of a sudden, he starts to feel funny. Well, they got in the car, and his partner looked at him, and he said, when I saw the look in my partner's eyes, I said, "What, you need to tell me what," because his partner looked at him like, and he said, "I just saw your pupils go wow, 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 wow." The pupils of his eyes did that. And what had happened, he had shaved, and there was, I don't know, how, he didn't have a suit on. He was just going in this acid laboratory, and you need to have like a full suit. And so he basically got dosed with, they said, 1,000 hits. And they said he was flipping out. He said it got so bad because you leave. You completely leave your reality, and you don't understand. You're hallucinating so much. You bypass your ego, and you don't exist anymore. You don't know that you are a human being and that you're on drugs. It's all gone, and it can take you, depending on what's going around outside of you. You can lose your life very easily. It can even fry you. It's a very, when you take that much acid, it's like you need to have a chemical light switch to shut it off, or someone who can chant and bring you down, a trip sitter, and a very experienced psychonaut. They didn't have anybody. It was just they just took them to this hospital. They were like, take them in the kids' wing, the kids' room. There's a little room for kids where they have like a daycare, and they put him in there. And they said, well, what about there's paintings of wizards and dragons and all this shit over the walls. And they said, well, shut the lights off. So they shuts the lights off on him, and that's the worst thing you could do, because then the hallucinations completely take over. And he said that he went through Dante's 8th level of hell. He was ready to give up, where he was tripping so hard that he was gone, and he was ready to give in. And this old nurse who had been around for the 60s, for when people used to take it, and people would take 20 hits, and she said, oh, you got to give him Valium. Because the rest, they were all like, oh, you just got to ride it out. Like, are you kidding me? And this is a cop. This is a police officer. And like, I know. Like, if I was with you and you couldn't handle it, and we didn't have access to any type of benzodiazepines or Valium, Xanax, anything like that, I would give you hard liquor. I would start doing shots. A shot and a beer, and after about 3 or 4 of those, you're going to be feeling a lot better than you were before. So yeah, they spiked him, they hit him with the intravenous, and saved his life with the Valium. So that's a great story. I talked about that. I mentioned it in another video, and some people were like, like they wanted the link. You can look it up, okay? If you think I'm making it up, I'm not going to post the link up. And again, all you need to do is type in Buchla LSD to find information out about this. I'm probably not going to. There's a really great article in Synthtopia. I typed in Buchla Synth LSD to find out more information. But you could just as well just type in BUCHLA space LSD, Buchla LSD. Synth technician accidentally dosed by LSD left in vintage synthesizer. the Buchla red panel LSD legend was true. Of course it was.